Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for having me here. It's my first time in St Leonard's, and I've spent the week here because I'm currently homeless, staying in a B&B just behind this building here. So it's lovely to be able to explore here, and to be in such a lovely room with such a friendly crowd. So Elizabeth Miller was born in 1907 in the small town of Poughkeepsie in upstate New York. And quite early on in life, she revealed herself to be she was going to walk a different path from most people at the time. As you can see, here she is looking stunningly attractive, and she always was. And here she is at the age of 18 when she went on a trip down to New York City. And she was walking out across the street, and she almost literally fell into a modelling career by stepping out onto the street and narrowly avoiding being hit by a bus. And she was rescued by a man whose name was Condé Nast. Now, I never knew that was actually a man's name, but yes, it was that. How many Condé Nasts are there? He was the one who was the founder and publisher of Vogue magazine. And he took one look at her and said, you should be a model. So he hired her as a model, and she started doing fashion shoots for Vogue magazine. Then shortly afterwards, while she was doing that, she took a break and went over to Paris for the first time. She managed to give her chaperone the slip because her chaperone didn't speak enough French to be able to order a taxi. So she wandered the streets of Paris and immediately decided that, in her words, this was my place, this was my home. And she fell in with an American artist who had also made Paris his home, the very handsome, striking man known as Man Ray. I'm guessing that's not what he looked like on their first date, but you know. So he was an artist and a member of the Surrealist group who were based in Paris, and he fell madly in love with her, as often happened with men at the time, when they met Lee Miller, as she then renamed herself, almost sort of like as an echo of Man Ray had been born Emmanuel Ruditsky, and he changed his name to Man Ray, and so she became, instead of Elizabeth, she became Lee Miller. And they became lovers. He was absolutely besotted with her, and she stole all his secrets in terms of photography, technique. She basically acted as his muse and inspiration, and in return, she learned how to become a photographer. He again used her as a muse, and he took these rather striking photographs of her in the early 1920s. This one, the most famous one, of her eyes with glycerin teardrops. But one day she was working in the darkroom as his assistant, and she accidentally opened a door and let some light in, and created a technique which is now widely known to photographers as solarization. It's this sort of strange outline that goes around the profile that you can see here. This is a photograph that he took of her. And who would have thought it, amazingly, he's largely credited with the invention of solarization. Who would have thought that a man would take credit for a woman's invention in the history of art? But there you go, it was actually her good fortune and happy accident that she came up with this. Having spent some time working with him, behind the camera, if you like, she decided that rather than, in her words, I no longer want to be a photo, I'd like to take them instead. So she started taking photographs of herself. This is one, a self-portrait that she took of herself for Vogue magazine. So she was then, if you like, promoted or moved sideways, depending on how you look at it, at Vogue in New York, and she became a photographer and doing lots and lots of fashion shoots, became very successful. At the same time, she was also flitting backwards and forwards to Paris and having a really really good crack at what you might call la vie bohème, where she got to take part in the sort of decadent picnics. Here she is with Man Ray and Man Ray's and Paul Eluard, who is also the founder of the one of the founders of the Surrealist movement. Here they are having a nice picnic, au naturel, in a rather nice echo of Edouard Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, what was probably a fantasy scenario to many men, certainly at that time. She made a reality. And then she slightly surprised everybody by moving to Egypt, where she married a man called Aziz Aloui Bey. And this was a great surprise to everybody at home. But she moved to Alexandria. And here she started taking photographs in earnest, because frankly there wasn't much else to do. The Bohemian lifestyle hadn't really made it as far as Egypt in the 1920s. And to be honest, she found it slightly restricting. It was a bit of a case of no sex please, we're Egyptian, and she was very much into the freer lifestyle that New York and Paris had offered her. But she did take some rather remarkable photographs, and from the very get-go she showed that she had an eye for things that were slightly different. This is a photograph taken in her tent. It's a photograph called A Void in Space. And she didn't just ignore the big tourist spots, such as the pyramids, but she did have a slightly sideways look at this one. Probably didn't end up as a postcard being sold at the foot of the pyramids of Cheops. Meanwhile, back in Paris, she started fraternizing with an Englishman who had come over, whose name was Roland Penrose. Roland Penrose was a fairly aristocratic surrealist painter and art dealer, and he'd come over to Paris to check out and hang out with the famous artists who were there in the pre-war years. And this is how she met Pablo Picasso. And Pablo Picasso started painting pictures of her. This is one of several portraits. I'm sure you can see the likeness of her. And they all became a tightly knit circle. Meanwhile, war was brewing in Europe, and she went back to England, and having divorced her Egyptian husband, she ended up marrying Roland Penrose, and they amused themselves by embracing the sort of what was then known as the phony war scenario, which was like that time between the declaration of war and the actual action bit starting about 6 or 8 months later. And here she is experimenting with camouflage techniques, which may or may not have made it as far as the Ministry of Defence, I don't know. They were open to a lot of ideas, but she was also taking photographs for British Vogue, because Vogue had a British edition by this point. And she took photographs of people, working in the war, but always with a slightly surrealistic, eye. These are actual masks that you would wear against flash and shrapnel and stuff like that. And then, after a while, she sort of slightly got a bit bored of taking photographs, doing photo stories based on 7 ways to tie a scarf and things like that. And fortunately for her, British Vogue decided that they needed a war correspondent. This may seem slightly weird that a fashion magazine would have a war correspondent during the Second World War, but it was a case of everybody doing their bit. So she was given a war correspondence pass, and in 1944, after the invasion of Europe, she went to Europe as one of 2 female journalists to correspond on the war. And here she is, looking pretty fabulous in khaki. But she got stuck in. She was right in there with the frontline troops, and she was mostly writing, but occasionally taking photographs. And she got out and about in her uniform and mixed it with the best of them. And you can imagine how unusual it was to have any woman in amongst the frontline troops, but there she was. Continuing her slightly sort of Zelig-like life pattern, where she was always in a particular place at the right time, she found herself in Paris the day that it was liberated. So she was the first photographer to take photographs of the newly liberated Paris. And again, combining her brilliant eye for portraiture and photography with a real innate sense of style and fashion. We've got this fantastic picture of a woman, French Parisian woman, with the most incredible hairdo and the cross of the Reign, which was the symbol of the Free French. So it's sort of symbolising, summing up something about Paris, and it's holding on to its stylishness despite having been occupied by the Germans for the last 4.5 years. And she took photographs in and around Paris of some of the debris and the bombed out buildings. Again, you could make nowadays you could make a sort of surrealist photo montage picture of something like this, and people would just go, well, yes, that's a great piece of art. But in fact, this was actually a bombed out building. As the war drew to a close, she started, and the Allies were moving forward. She found herself exploring the states around Europe, and she made her way into what was now Czechoslovakia, where she took time out to be massaged by a bear. She was never one to shy away from a new experience. And speaking of which, she had got hold of the address of Hitler's old flat in Munich before he left on to greater things. And she went in, she and her photographer colleague broke into his flat, and she went in there and she had a bath in Hitler's bathtub. And she later slept in his bed. She'd slightly dressed the set to make it more symbolic, so there's a picture of Hitler on the left-hand side, and then there's an angel on the right-hand side. And some people suggest that she positioned the shower, the hose, to be a sort of, almost like a noose in a sort of warlike scenario. So it was all going swimmingly for her, and then after the war ended, rumours started going around of things that were being discovered in Germany and some of its occupied states. In particular, a place not far from Berlin called Dachau. And so she went to Dachau, and she was the first woman photographer to be allowed into the concentration camp at Dachau, where she took a number of very powerful pictures of not only the prisoners who had survived, but also the guards as well. These guards had tried to dress up in civilian clothes that they'd stolen off the inmates, and tried to pass themselves off as prisoners, and been caught by the prisoners, who were strong enough to beat the crap out of them. And this very powerful photo of two German guards was the result. So that was the end of her war, and it was quite a thing. And she, by contrast, went back to England and was wondering what to do with her life. And she and Roland Penrose, who by this time was now founding the ICA, which is the Institute of Contemporary Arts, which is now on the Mall in London, this little sort of island of modern art on the road that's probably the most traditional bit of Englishness that you'll ever find. And she and Roland moved to a farm called Farley's Farm in a village called Chiddingly, which is near Lewes in East Sussex. And here they set up house. And it was quite an extraordinary scene. It must have been an extraordinary scene for the locals, who, to have an American living in their village was very unusual, let alone one they were continually being visited for weekends and holidays by people like Pablo Picasso, Jean Art, and other European artists who would be well, cavorting around the village and causing a great stir. But it's quite an amazing house. And they really put, whilst the exterior looks like a very traditional East Sussex exterior, they set to decorating the inside. And all throughout the house, there are paintings and decorations by Roland Penrose and various of his friends and people who he had supported and patronised. Most notably, in the kitchen, there's a kitchen tile just above the cooker, which was painted by Pablo Picasso, and it's still there. You can see what they did to the fireplace here. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary thing. And they would hold dinner parties for the swinging set of the 1940s and 50s, and she became a great sort of she'd stopped taking photographs by this point, and she sort of became like a hostess. In that she spent a lot of time preparing these amazing meals for all the guests. She was always quite sort of mischievous in that she would, if anybody came to stay and they said, oh, I don't like such and such, well, that's what you'd be getting for dinner. Also, Roland Penrose famously didn't like spicy foods, so she would make hotter and hotter chilies and curries, especially when she found out that the fact that she was basically living in a menage a trois, with her husband, and a trapeze artist. So this was all quite a strange experience, and she was basically starting to drink quite a lot by this point, and she was slightly losing her way in what would now be diagnosed as PTSD after her experiences in the war. And so she found solace in cookery and travel, foodie travel, which was a new thing at the time. She and a friend used to travel to Spain, around the Mediterranean, trying out these new dishes, bringing them back to England, where everything was suet, steak and kidney pudding and heaven only knows what. And she started exploring other cuisines and practicing them to the extent that she entered the Norwegian Tourist Board's annual competition, to make a smorgasbord, which is the open sandwich that is traditional in the Scandinavian state. And she won first prize, and she won the second prize, and she won the third prize as well. Here's some smorgasbord yesterday. These are what she made. She also threw herself into winning countless of those competitions that you get on soap powder packets where it says, complete this phrase in 12 words or less. She had such a way with words that she just won white goods till they were just backing out into the back garden with washing machines, all the newfangled stuff. But in the meantime, she was becoming more and more depressed, drinking more, and when anybody ever asked her about what she'd done in her life beforehand about photography, she just said, oh, I don't remember it. And I haven't got any of my photos anyway. So, let's just have another drink and see what's for dinner. But in fact, what happened was that after she died in 1977, age 70, of cancer, they've discovered in her attic over 60,000 negatives and slides of photographs that she'd taken. And so this is how I prefer to remember her, as a beautiful, glamorous and talented woman. And you can now go and see the house in the summer. The house in Chiddingly is open during the summer months. And it is overseen by her and Roland Penrose's son, Anthony, who still lives in the house and still sort of works to maintain her legacy with a series of books and exhibitions that he runs in his talented mother's memory. And that's the end of my talk about Lee Miller. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.